Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for a conversation about what it's like, what it's going to be like when it comes to modern assessment in a test optional world. Now, we know that this topic has been steadily in the news. It's been in the news in recent years for all kinds of things, but this year in particular, as we watched institutions go test optional because of COVID, now we're starting to figure out, like, how do we actually know what students know, and how are we going to make up for some of the gaps that, even though the SAT and ACT weren't perfect, how are we going to fill in the different roles that it played for us in society, and specifically K-12 and higher ed. So today I'm delighted to bring you a panel of experts who I think are going to give you a very clear perspective of kind of what the risks are, what the challenges, and what the opportunities for you at home, for parents, for students, and for our country. So I am delighted to first introduce to you my panelists. So first, I am joined by Dr. Liz Brooks, who is the Chief Learning Officer at Lexia Learning and Rosetta Stone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Michael Nettles, who is the Senior Vice President of Education Testing Service. So he'll definitely have some thoughts. Zoran Popovic, who is the founder and Chief Scientist at NLearn. And Kevin Martin, who's the General Manager of Higher Education for Parchment. So welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for taking the time to share your expertise with us. So I wanted to first kick us off to make sure that everyone kind of has a sense of where your worldview is on this topic. And I'm just going to share this open-ended with you. If each of you could share with me briefly when it comes to modern assessment in a test optional world on this topic, what either keeps you up at night or what gives you hope. So Liz, could you share with us either of those so that we have a sense of kind of how you're looking at this?
Sure. Thanks so much, Bridget, and nice to be with all of you today. So Lexia Learning is primarily in the K-12 space in the literacy world, and Rosetta Stone, of course, cuts across K-12 and higher ed. I'm going to take a focus on the K-12 world right now, just again in this remote world. What concerns me is how do we continue to give our educators reliable assessment data in this remote environment. And what also concerns me is that, assessment gets a bad rap, but it's really powerful in helping to personalize and individualize instruction. So I think there's a real opportunity to think about how can we leverage technology, especially in this remote world, to continue to give our educators that really valuable information. And then I guess in a higher ed sense, how concerned that one test score can be used to judge someone's achievement versus potential opportunity. So I think there's some challenges, but definitely some exciting areas to think about in terms of modern assessment.
Wonderful, great. I was wondering, Michael, I'm wondering if you might be able to share your again, to double up on that in terms of, from your worldview at ETS, what either keeps you up at night about this topic or what is actually giving you some optimism?
Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you, Bridget and Liz and Mike and Martin. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. What keeps me up at night these days are two things. One is trying to figure out when people will get back to normal with the practice of assessment. We saw in March and April of this year, the world changed dramatically for the testing industry. There was a period of no testing, and now we're in remote proctoring testing, and it's a fraction of what it was. So that keeps me up a little bit. What also keeps me up is something that was keeping me awake even before COVID-19, and that is the vast difference among demographic population groups. I worry a lot about the adequate representation that we're given to people, for one thing. I think that some population groups are a lot brighter than they're represented or reflected to be on test. What gives me hope is that during this period of time, people are rethinking how do testing. And they're also finding it to be a necessity. The information that people get from testing has shown more value these days than maybe we realized that it had before. And what gives me hope is that people are looking for options, new ways to do it, new approaches, new technologies for delivering it. So a variety of opportunities ahead.
Wonderful. I agree. I don't think that I really appreciated the value of testing up, and I saw it as an impediment. But now, in our pre-conversation, we talked about how it was, wow, how are we going to actually know what our students know? How are we going to be able to make sure they're in the right places and they're being supported in the right way? So I appreciate that perspective. Kevin, I'm wondering if you can add some additional nuance, because I know that Parchment, you have a unique viewpoint in this space. Can you share with us a little bit about either keeps you up at night or what you're excited about?
Yeah, when I think about tests, I mean, as it pertains to standardized testing and college admissions as an example, the way that it started, right, I think had all the best intentions in the world. And Mike, to your point, and Liz, yours as well, it's in large part how the recipient uses it. And so I think that college admissions in particular has used tests to identify and exclude students and the process in a lot of ways. And I don't think that was the intent of it. I think that also the way that and that's what keeps me up at night, is that if there is an alternative, right, whatever that alternative is, whether it be your GPA, whether it be your some type of portfolio, fill in the blank, that new assessment would be used to do the same thing. And so what I hope for, and I think the opportunity is before us, and I still think this is the opportunity that's before all assessments, candidly, is that it begins to highlight and include students and really see where the opportunity is. I think that I think the test has identified a lot of gaps in opportunity for students, Michael, to your point, where it's revealed, hey, there's a lot of students that don't have the same opportunities. And so how can we use assessments to drive filling in those gaps and opportunities such that all students can be included at these various stages of their academic career, such that they go on forward. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and that's what excites me.
Great. Zoran, can you bring us home so folks understand your perspective on this topic, and then we'll dive into a deeper level of discussion. You are on mute, so we're gonna guess
so
what you
from
said.
My perspective, what keeps me up at night is how can the testing provide a deeper insight into the entire person that every student is, from the perspective of understanding a lot more than just a mere amount of sort of knowledge of math or English language that we want to assess. Especially in the equity settings, where the assessment is often used to just further label or practically really demoralize a lot of the population from the perspective of just cold numbers that they're presented with. What I'm really, and what keeps me up in an excited way at night is the ability to think about this thing as an opportunity to, if somebody does just 5 minutes of assessment, perhaps in next 5 minutes, they will see the measured improvement on the thing that they actually identified as an issue. And if that becomes possible, then all of a sudden the engagement, and you can have teachers not wanting to give you back the tablet because they don't want to teach in any other way except for knowing a lot more than we do. So generally speaking, what keeps me up at night is that in education, we kind of flying a plane with a pilot who is more or less having no indicator devices on their panels. And when we do test, we test when we land, if we land. The fundamental thing that we really need to change is how do we know as much as possible every moment from the perspective of every student and every classroom in terms of what they need. That's the key thing that I think is the quantum leap that I think technology is now allowing us to make.
That's great. So I get from this that for folks who are at home, and by the way, if you are at home, please feel free to submit questions to help us dig a little bit deeper on any of these tension points. What I'm hearing is that assessment matters probably more than we thought, but it was imperfect to what we had. Now we're in this weird moment where everything kind of has changed. And so the questions I'm hearing are around, Michael, you talked about how you saw additional creativity for folks in terms of they're starting to come up with new innovative ways to try and do this. But Liz, I'm worried about our ability to actually assess where students are. And then in the midst of this, we're dealing with major learning loss in the midst of COVID. So I'm just wondering if, Liz, can you help us think about, especially from the K-12 perspective, how do teachers even think about where, and understand where students' gaps are, especially in the midst of, we think they're growing, and we think they're growing in the demographic groups that Michael told us that we need to worry about.
Yeah. And Zoran, I love your analogy of, the instruments are blank until we land, right? And that's kind of the traditional end of year assessment. And so, Bridget, to get at your question of how do we help these teachers know where the students' gaps are? Because in order to close the gaps, and you've heard about COVID learning loss and COVID slide, and it's real, it's very real. But in order to close those gaps or slow them down, teachers need data, and they need it while they're flying, not at the end of the year. So that's where I think we can leverage some of the AI, right, and the technology to be capturing data somewhat, again, Zoran, to your point of just all the time on an ongoing basis in the background through their work. And that can happen through technology-based programs, even in the remote world, or if they're in the classroom. But then the really important part is, and I think this, Kevin, goes back to what you said about the HI. We talk about the human intelligence, not just the AI, but the human intelligence, and connecting those two pieces so that the user of that data, the teacher, can be very targeted and time efficient with his or her instruction. And again, when we think about the equity issues, the idea, one of the statements that really stood out to me from Professor Kendi's book, How to Be Anti-Racist, he talked about we need to standardize not the tests and the curriculum, but standardize the opportunities, so that we are not thinking about it as an achievement gap, but standardize the opportunities. And how do we do that is by personalizing based on understanding, some of the students' performance gaps in areas of need. And I just say this last thing as kind of maybe a segue to another question is, of course, the underlying or overarching question of assessment is, what are you measuring, right? And I'm talking strictly from a skills and standards standpoint in the K-12 system, but we also know there's social emotional and trauma and, the whole child, whole student. So, but I do think there's really powerful ways to do it through technology. And Zoran, to your point, give those pilots the tools that they can adjust and personalize that flight plan before they get to the landing.
That's great. I want to dig now that you've given us some thought about like why it really matters and what we should definitely want assessment. I'm also wanting to understand the higher ed, the loss here a little bit deeper. Kevin, you mentioned a tiny bit about the sorting process. Can you share specifically what you think are the true concerns of where's the vacuum that's developing as a result of the SAT and ACT being optional that is affecting higher ed, and help us walk through consequences that go beyond admissions?
Yeah, I mean, and in fairness, the folks from the ACT and the SAT aren't here to talk about their components, but having been in the admissions world previously, and then also working with Parchment works with high schools, colleges, universities through different parts of the admissions process. When you or your child or your niece, your nephew, whomever, your friends' children take a standardized test, they typically will fill out a few questions on where do you want these test scores sent to. And that list completion gives them, it gets passed along to schools in different ways for them to begin recruiting students that meet different criteria that fit the type of class that they're trying to shape. And so in the absence of tests being taken, it's the first time that Kevin becomes introduced to a school isn't when Kevin typically applies. It's well before then. It's because Kevin's taken a standardized test. And so that vacuum is going to become pretty present very quickly for institutions that are trying to shape classes for next year and the year after. And then naturally, then there's other elements in terms of schools, colleges, and universities traditionally are used to making admissions decisions to some degree or another, and then financial aid decisions based upon standardized test scores in part. And so absent those, many schools, I think it was 900 plus pre the pandemic, were going test optional. Post pandemic, it's almost double that now. Well, not that we're in it, whether or not that sticks or not, TBD, obviously. But I think there's a lot of things that have been pulled forward, and that has to be filled. So yeah, I as a first generation college student who only applied to 3 schools, not knowing about them, there's a great opportunity in schools reaching out to you because you've done that type of thing. And I think there's a big gap there that needs to be filled. And again, to Liz, to your point, there's a huge opportunity here, and that we can start to include students that we wouldn't have otherwise. Colleges and universities still do, to varying degrees, brag about like how high the standardized test scores are for the students that come there. How do we make that not the marker of who we keep out, but who we include?
Right. Michael, I want to dig a little deeper on the creativity and innovation that could be spurred by this, especially because I think the underlying question here is, does it come back at all? Do the SATs or ACT ever come back? And, if not, give us an idea of where we should be thinking or looking in terms of how we might evolve to try and meet some of the gaps that are emerging. So we heard we need to actually know what people know. We need to be able to support students, but also it actually, financial aid, scholarships, things like this, and also getting you on the list for colleges. Inherently racist, yes, imperfect instrument, but what are we going to do? Do you really have any sense that you can give us about what that creativity or other new solutions we can think about post-pandemic to fill this gap might look like?
Yeah, sure. I think the answer to the question generally is will they come back? I think so. I think the question is in what form, and to what extent will they look the same as they did before? We were already in a period of test optional, as you just heard Kevin elaborate on, but we were also in a period of holistic file review, where people are looking for a broader range of data in the admissions process and information about people, such as their Liz referred to social emotional skills, but their ability to persist, their commitment to education, their determination, their sense of goals. Do they have a sense of where they want to go? It's early in this new year to really know the extent to which people are making adjustments and how they're making adjustments. Faculty are just learning how to teach. Many faculty are remotely for the first time, and to think about giving secure tests even for classes is probably a challenge that we'll have to monitor and measure. What was happening also on the verge of the pandemic was the movement toward comprehensive learner records and interoperable learner records between K through 12 and higher education. And I think that in my sense in conversations with people is that this is an opportunity to accelerate the pace toward those new kinds of standards. the college admissions and registrar's offices at CRAO just introduced the new guidelines for these comprehensive learner records in May of 2020. We're seeing schools around the country now starting to do mastery transcripts and mastery curricula. So I think that the opportunity for creativity is going to lie in that realm, where people will be looking for skills and credentials that people acquire in smaller doses leading up to admissions, and then the documentation of more skills and more abilities, and making judgments about people on a broader range of criteria.
Helpful, thank you. And okay. All right, Kevin, I'm going to let you, but Zoran, I'm coming to you about some AI questions. They're coming from the chat, so go ahead and respond, Kevin.
Yeah, so Michael, I wanted to jump on your mastery transcript and CLR comment, and I actually think that the mastery transcript conversation is happening right now, so we'll see who has the most attendees. But on the comprehensive learner record, you talked about ACRO coming out with their details on that. I couldn't agree more. I think that there's a huge opportunity, whether it be college and universities talking about the in and out of classroom experiences that their students are getting, but then also high schools doing the same, talking about the leadership experiences that their students are exposed to, service learning, and so on, where if a test score is ultimately an assessment as a type of credential representing what the learner knows and how well they know it, then having something more comprehensive to the total educative experience, I think there's a huge opportunity for technology, for companies to come alongside schools to help them collect and describe that the learner's full educative experience in a way that maybe the learner doesn't even realize how to describe. And then also for recipients to be able to ingest that in an efficient way. And I think that's where technology can help bridge that gap really meaningful, where it's not just a letter of rec, right, or a resume, but it's this holistic thing that the institution endorses, but the recipient can also consume efficiently.
Right. And Zoran, I want to see, you can respond to that, but I also, we got two questions that I want to pull together because of the background of NLearn and thinking about, how you have expertise around adaptive learning and personalized learning. First, folks are wanting really clear examples of what the alternative assessments look like. And I'm just more wanting to go into the AI aspect of what have you found that in your work in terms of how can AI assist us with that, with assessment, but also specifically about neurodiverse students, anything that can help us better, serve them. Yeah, if you could just solve all these things, that'd be great.
Okay, that's three separate things, but that's great. I can speak to all of those things. I would say, concretely speaking, imagine if the assessment can take only 5 minutes, and it's really just kind of, I think of it as an insightful practice, right? So you're just practicing, you're not taking teachers' time, whether it's in college or in K-12. And in those 5 minutes, you can find out more information, let's say 15 times more information than you would in a single problem will give you 15 times more information than a single problem in a standard way that it's presented, both on paper, but perhaps even together on technology where you just enter your answer in a box. That changes everything from the perspective that we don't have this collective dread of testing, right? Where even if it's not at the end of the quarter, if it's end of the module or even end of the week, it's already too late because the instructor needs to move on to the next thing right away. There's nothing to actually be done about. So if it's just 5 minutes, that means you can test 3 times within the classroom. So you can have an entry ticket, exit ticket, and mid-class ticket, where the insights of the dashboard will not tell you, will not classify, label your students, but will actually give you actionable things like, here's what you could be explaining for next 5 minutes that will most benefit your entire classroom collectively. Or here's who you as a student with kind of Swiss cheese of knowledge of missing pieces from last 2 or 3 years. If you focused on this particular thing in the next 10 minutes, in a subsequent test that will also take 5 minutes, you will observably see the change in your knowledge. If you have that kind of behavior, or if the teacher says, okay, I don't trust this, but I'll try it, and 15 minutes later, I'll do a post-test, and if he sees, wow, I actually moved my classroom by a particular significant amount, you start to build this belief that this is valuable. There is a direct benefit to me as a student or me as a teacher for this, and therefore I will use it more often. That kind of self-feeding mechanism will actually install a completely new way of thinking about testing and what it's really for, right? Especially in sort of disenfranchised students who really see very little benefit other than just bringing them further down. If they see wherever they are found that there's a progress within the next 5 minutes, it can change their attitude towards knowledge in a more fundamental way than advanced students would. And I can actually tell you that the teacher in some of our trials, when provided this information, ends up helping 4 times as many students, and the most struggling students get 16 times more help than exactly the same teacher teaching without that particular information. So there's actually a behavior change on the same person with and without that information. That's the thing that I think is really exciting. So to speak to your second question, has to do with technology and AI. I would say that the thing that I'm really hopeful about, and what I've seen evidence is that if you can follow the student's thinking process while they're solving the problem, all of a sudden you have way more information than trying to reverse engineer what they don't know based on the end results. And we were actually able to do that. That means that AI is following in real time the set of interactions that the student is doing as they're solving a complex word problem. So you're not just getting the answer, you're seeing how they're modeling the representation of that mathematical problem, which things they bring to bear from previous knowledge, and that kind of information ends up being way more important. And then tied with a third point that you were bringing up, because you can follow the thinking process, all of a sudden, and we have some really exciting things recently on executive function, you can have measures on both working memory and inhibitory control, all while they're solving this mathematical problem, meaning you can understand a lot more about them as a person with deeper implications of how the help can be provided, not just from the instructor, but perhaps parent in K-12 setting, etc. So all of those things become possible with the way that the technology is now able to do this, and even more so suitable now in the COVID setting where everything is remote.
So, but Zoran, you're talking about higher education, right? That your examples are higher ed specific?
In both K-12 and higher education.
Okay,
I think
that's helpful.
I was generally speaking to, for example, in higher education, what you have is a nurse. If somebody wanted to go to a nursing school, they need to take statistics for that. They can't because they don't have algebra. All of a sudden, that algebra that's in middle school and high school becomes a fundamental impediment to us having more nurses. There's actually only 30% of the demand of nurses currently that's actually filled. So the question is, how can that person be able to find out that as soon as possible?
Great. And so I just want to drive this back to K-12 though, because I want to make sure that we're not just saying amazing and super accurate testing is possible in the future and best wishes, something that can be realistic and implemented today in K-12 as well, because we're talking about essentially there's a huge void where these tests that we used to rely upon are not being used. We now see that some of the scaffolding of our work has been structured around these tests. And while those aren't necessarily the outcomes that we wanted, we have to figure those things out. So Liz, I'm just wondering about, one question that we've gotten from the audience, and we also had talked about prior, is just do we actually need testing at all given the amount of data that we have about students? If you're thinking about K-12 and the amount of data that you have, if we could design solutions for the things that Kevin and Michael and Zoran gave us a hint about in terms of, financial aid and sorting and all of the scaffolding of testing, do we have enough data to make up to make it so that we could just actually say that, let's just do better assessment period and we actually we don't necessarily need to have big tests at all?
Sure, and I think to just go to the point that Zoran made, in K-12, we're doing this now. Lexia has embedded assessment in our programs, and it can be as complicated as, you know, understanding the thought process, or it could be as basic as they're doing a short vowels activity and they struggle when they come to short I and short E. And then we tell the teacher short I and short E is what Michael and Kevin and Bridget need help with. And here's a lesson on how to deliver a lesson on that. So that's happening now, you know, in over almost 20,000 schools across the country. So I think if schools are using, going back to the plane analogy, if schools are using embedded assessment, ongoing progress monitoring assessment to personalize and target their instruction, then the need for as much kind of standardized or once a year testing can go away. Because the other thing that we're doing at Lexia and other places, I'm sure, we're correlating those measures along the way to the outside measure. So we can almost predict fairly accurately your performance at the end of year. But the best thing is you can do something about it now. So again, the purpose of assessment in a formative way is to do something about it now. K-12 teachers don't have to wait till the end of the year assessment, right? This is what COVID as a silver lining is, maybe they're seeing the power of that ongoing assessment. What I don't know is, will we ever do away with kind of end of year assessment? Because that's for a different purpose. That is to assess your massive amount of knowledge that you've gained across the year versus we're working in these individual skills. So, but I think too, going back to the comprehensive learner record, maybe if we're able, the one concern I have about that, I think it's a phenomenal idea. I think it's a next generation of the profile or portfolio. But can schools do it at scale? That's, I guess, would be a question. And if so, then we can maybe do away with the one time of year test if we have this ongoing formative assessment. But again, the idea of scale, Michael, might be something you can speak to.
I think, thank you. I think that the kind of assessments that Liz is describing is very motivational for people potentially. In one school district that I'm becoming more familiar with is the aim is to establish these digital wallets so that students actually have the opportunity to do the kind of assessment and engage on a regular basis with assessment the way Liz is describing it, so that it both contributes to their learning, but also gives them some recognition and acknowledgement of what they've learned, and even to the point of badging. And the idea is that this would give students much more control over their education, more ownership of it. And for many, it may even lead to, you know, be inspirational for achievement. On the other hand, the large scale standardized test, I'm of the opinion that they will continue. And they serve, as Liz pointed out, different purposes, but one of which is accountability. Because policymakers sort of have, and educators have struck a deal that more autonomy on the one hand, both in elementary and secondary education and higher education, you know, the freedom to deliver the education along a reasonable path, independent of policymakers' oversight on a regular daily basis in exchange for knowing at the end of the term. So I don't see any states that are describing their futures in a way that suggests that they're going to get rid of RFPs for large-scale standardized tests. And in some cases, end of course statewide tests are being used to decide, who gets a standard diploma versus who gets a certificate of completion. I just don't see that going away very soon.
Kevin, I want you to take us home, but we specifically have a question around, employers don't have a test for skills. Why, it doesn't make sense that colleges are so obsessed with them. I just would love, we've talked about K-12, we've talked about higher ed, and I would love for you to give us a sense of why this also matters for employers and where this innovation is something we really need to accelerate, specifically because graduates being able to communicate their skills to an employer seems to be a nebulous place.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. From the employment perspective, I'm going to tack on to Michael what you said about the accountability component, and Bridget, and I'll answer into yours as well. I think that if you look at a school, whether it's a elementary, high school, college, university, I think that there are some states where you're starting to see policymakers give credit to schools for the progress acceleration that students have seen through assessment. So it's not just about what is the ultimate average score, but for a group of students who may have been attaining at a lower level, and then teacher A really helped them move up and help them accelerate where there was a gap before, they're giving credit to those teachers, schools, districts that are doing that. In South Carolina, we've observed that from some of our partnerships there. And so switching over, Bridget, to your comment about, this all matters because, at least whether it be completing high school for jobs or completing college for jobs and employment, there's still a premium in this country on access to good, high-paying jobs. You've got to have a 2 or a 4-year degree or some type of certificate related to that, and access into those opportunities are limited by some of the tests that are being done. So although it's somewhat indirect to employment, that is the path to employment in the U.S. And I think that's where it begins to matter. Employers aren't asking for your high school transcript. Well, not necessarily. Some of them do, I guess, but they aren't necessarily asking for, did you read Beowulf, right? They aren't necessarily interested in that. But I think that it is a path to it, and that's why it matters from an employment perspective, because ultimately a degree is a big differentiator for employment opportunities. And we've seen that in the pandemic and in the K-shaped recovery. Those that do have a degree and don't have been impacted very disparately in the last 6 months.
All right, so this has been super helpful, Michael. I want to wrap us up with one last kind of round robin with you all. I'm thinking about, for our folks at home, you've asked great questions. I feel like we've given folks a clear sense of what the real underlying challenge around assessment is, why we need it. Didn't love what we had before. Things are pretty hard right now. There are definitely going to be some consequences, but also that there is some incredible technology and incredible innovation that we can rely upon right now, especially because we're all virtual, that we could possibly be able to move to a new world. Michael, you said that you thought that the SAT, ACT is coming back, and I'll be interested to see if that's true, because I feel like a lot of universities have been, it took a lot of courage to become test optional, but they've been wanting to do it for a really long time. I think of it as COVID is giving them it's like they're taking the COVID exit, because the politics are a little bit less dicey and a little bit less complicated. Plus, you have the logic of the pandemic. So I'll be curious if you're right, and we might actually take some Vegas odds to just see in the future. But I will just ask each of you to speak briefly to give folks some perspective about going forward. We've laid out the underlying issues, and what I would love is if you have a magic wand, given what we just talked about in terms of how important this is, how there's some opportunity, but we've got some major needs. What would you do going forward to try and set ourselves up to have a more equitable system? So, and address some of the challenges that you yourselves have brought up. I will start with Zoran. Oh, Michael, you lean forward. It's all you, man.
No, I was just going to say that I would first establish the goal of trying to make assessments deliver winners, and to have everybody have us as our major challenge to create an assessment system that allowed everybody to win. And in the past and presently, we have winners and losers, people who don't get the most out of assessments. And I think our biggest challenge is to try to, because we want an educated society, we want everybody to engage in lifelong learning and education. And I think our biggest challenges, and my magic wand would, be to create winners out of everybody who experiences assessment.
Great. All right. Liz, in 30 seconds, can you give us your magic wand?
My magic wand would be, if anybody's going to give any kind of assessment, before they do, they can answer, what question is this data going to help me answer, right? There's so many different purposes for assessment. And so it's hard to make a broad statement. So is it going to help me tell me who's at risk, or a profile or something like that? So I want people to understand the purpose of the assessment they're going to give before they just give it to check a box. So that's my hope.
Kevin?
My hope would be, and I agree with you, Michael, and I think that there's an opportunity before everybody in the assessment space, is that assessments start being used to the extent that they aren't already, to include people and not exclude people from the opportunities that we have in our educational system.
Right. Zoran, you have the last word, and then folks, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, so I would actually echo that from the perspective of, if the assessments can actually help those that are most disenfranchised by way of only being presented if the immediate benefit is obvious within minutes or hours, that's the magic wand with it. Because if that's possible, we wouldn't be having these discussions about usefulness of assessment. It would be plainly obvious.